I received a bunch of follow-up questions on my video about the U.S. Department of Labor increasing the minimum salary amount for most exempt employees with another increase scheduled for January 1st that's being challenged in court. You can watch that video, but here I'll be answering some of the most common questions I saw. And in the comments, I'll put timestamps so you can have your specific question answered or go look at that. One caveat I have to make as a lawyer is that I've been a lawyer and I make these videos to break down complex topics to be a bit more understandable, but I'm not your lawyer or anyone's lawyer. I don't practice law anymore. So I can't give any specific individual advice. That's what a lawyer that you contact would have to give you. But I do hope that these videos are helpful and give explanations that aren't always easy to find. First question, who does the FLSA apply to? Is there like a minimum number of employees? Now, a lot of employment laws are like that. They only apply to employers if they have like 15, 25, some number of employees. But the Fair Labor Standards Act about wages and overtime nationwide, that applies a bit differently. So you have to have 2 or more employees, but then it looks at the category. So if it's a government employer or a school, those are covered. If it's a business that makes $500,000 or more in a year, they're covered. So some people will say, okay, what about nonprofits? Well, nonprofits may not qualify if they don't meet other tests, but if they do have things like a gift shop or they perform services for fees and they meet that $500,000 amount, then they can potentially be qualified. So nonprofits can be a little different. Another question is, why do schools care? One of the groups challenging the minimum salary increase in court is the Association of Christian Schools. But people say, why do they care if teachers aren't covered? And it's true that certain professions, teachers, lawyers, and doctors, do not have minimum salary amounts, so they're exempted from that. Also, outside salespersons, like traveling salespersons, they don't, because oftentimes they'll have like commission plans. But schools may care because they have other like staff and administrators who are covered because they're not teachers, so they would be covered by that minimum salary amount. And so those groups are still challenging that in court. They're one of a number. Another question I got is, what if you make more than the minimum amount? Like right now, it's about $44,000 as of July 1st. It's scheduled to go up to about $59,000 January 1st. What if you make $70,000? So then do you get an increase if other people get increased? Well, your employer could certainly choose to do that, but the law does not require any increases. You can make more than the minimum. They're just setting that minimum amount by the Department of Labor. Another question is, does minimum salary mean salary, or do bonuses and commissions count too? Well, the answer is that up to 10% of the minimum salary amount can come from non-discretionary commissions and bonuses. So what that means is specifically, right now, as of July 1st, that minimum salary amount is $43,888. And so your employer could pay 90% of that, which, hold please, I had to look at my calculator. It's $39,499. So that could be your salary, and then you could make the rest in bonuses and commissions. But they have to be non-discretionary. So that's like by a formula, not just like, here's a $3,000 reward. But if you get to the end of the year and you haven't made, that difference, which is about $4,400, let's say you only made $2,000. Well, your employer would have to make a catch-up payment at the end of the year so that your yearly total is at least that minimum of $43,888. So yes, it can come from commissions and bonuses, but if you don't meet it, you still have to pay it. So it's kind of a little funky. Another question is, what about highly compensated employees? Well, this is another category of exemptions. So as I've said, most exemptions, you have to meet 2 tests, like the minimum salary test. Again, some don't have that, like teachers, lawyers, doctors, outside salespersons, but also that duties test. Well, there may be some roles that you meet that minimum salary test, but you don't meet all of the duties. Like it might be a manager that manages like one person, you manage them, but you don't have like hire and fire authority, so you might not meet everything under the executive exemption that otherwise a manager might meet. Well, what you have under the Fair Labor Standards Act and by the DOL is highly compensated employees. And so this has a much higher salary. That the reasoning behind it is that if you're making this much money than the Department of Labor assumes, then you are able to control your working hours, have more say over those, so you don't need to be eligible for overtime as like a penalty for employers for working you so much. And yes, I know a lot of people will say, haha, even highly paid people don't have control over working hours, which is often true, but that's the reasoning behind it. So under highly compensated employees, the salary, as I said, is much higher. So as of July 1st, it went up to about $132,000. And as of January 1st, it's going up to about $151,000 as the minimum. But so if you have that and you get those salaries, you only have to meet one of the duties to be classified as exempt. Another question is, what about salaried non-exempt? And yes, that's a thing. When people say salaried, they generally mean salaried exempt. because that's where you get paid the salary, set amount, no matter how many hours you work. You generally don't have to keep track of your time unless you're like billing time to clients or your employer keeps it for another reason. But salaried non-exempt is different. So you are eligible for overtime and have to keep track of your time in some way. So what that can often look like is your employer may say, okay, you're expected to work 40 hours a week, but you're salaried non-exempt because you don't meet whether it's the salary test or the duties test. So if you work less than 40 hours in a week, you generally would make your same salary. But if you work more than that, then you're eligible for overtime at that rate. And so they figure out that rate by taking your salary, generally divide it by 40, and then time and a half that. So oftentimes, though, what you see when people are salaried non-exempt is like, it looks like they work about 40 hours a week. So you do see it, but salaried non-exempt is a thing. One caveat that I'm sure somebody will say in the comments is there are things like fluctuating work week, which is like an alternative way to calculate overtime, which is a bit complex. You can Google it and look at it, but there is that and some kind of alternative methods with like salaried non-exempt. It just gets to be a little funky and more complex than this video probably needs. But another question is, what about part-time exempt? And yes, that could be a thing. So exempt means you're exempt from overtime no matter how many hours or how few hours you work. So your employer can say, yeah, you'll be salaried, exempt, making $60,000 a year, but we only expect you to work 20 hours a week. Employee can totally agree on that. And so you can have that to be part-time exempt. You just don't tend to see it as common. Another question, what about 1099 employees? No, not a thing. So 1099 means you're an independent contractor. So by definition, that means you're not an employee. And independent contractors are not covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act like that. So don't have these minimum salary things. But one caveat is just because someone is called an independent contractor doesn't mean they are. You have to meet that legal test to be a contractor and actually to be exempt from the FLSA. So no, like as a 1099, you wouldn't be covered by the FLSA. A lot of people call that 1099 employee, but that's not a thing. You're either an independent contractor or an employee. And you may be an employee under a contract, but a 1099 should not be called an employee. Another question is, what about employees that are classified as exempt now but make less than that minimum salary? Well, I made a whole other video on this, but in short, employees that, let's say they make $50,000, but it's scheduled to go up to $59,000 roughly on January 1st, if it does take effect and it's not halted in court. Well, employers have basically two choices. They can either increase the salary to that minimum and keep them exempt, or they can convert them to non-exempt. But then what you tend to see happen is someone has like a $50,000 salary, all of a sudden becomes like a $14, $15 hourly rate because the employer is trying to keep that total pay level the same. So that hourly rate decreases to take into account overtime and things like that. That hourly rate would have to be higher than whatever the minimum wage is based on the state that employee works in. But yes, that's what the two choices that you tend to see happen. Another question. So what are the benefits to being a salaried exempt employee? Well, ostensibly, you're paid that same salary no matter how many or how few hours you work, just to get the job done. So yes, you can get that same salary for 60, 70 hours a week, but also if you're really efficient, can do the job in like 10 to 20 hours a week, then you get that salary, but don't work as much. But that's by law. In practice, what tends to happen, if your employer saw you getting the job done in 10 to 20 hours a week, they just give you more work. But that's why I tell managers and really senior leaders to reward people's efficiencies with giving them that time back, not just adding continuously more work to people's plate if they are efficient. Another question, why all the talk of the minimum salaries and not the duties test? That's because the duties test hasn't changed in years. It's the minimum salary only that's been impacted like the last decade or so. Another question, why does the Department of Labor increase salaries if they know they're just going to get challenged in court? Well, I'm not a lawyer for the Department of Labor or the Department of Justice who's pushing these in court, but they're trying to figure out where courts will allow and what that dollar amount looks like, because there has been a salary test since the 1930s, but now it's trying to see where those courts will allow. So we will find out between now and December 31st with that current increase expected for January 1st. Last question, will the election impact this? Likely, because what you saw in 2016 was that President Obama's Department of Labor had increased that minimum significantly, but it got halted at the last minute by a Texas federal judge. And when President Trump took office, his Department of Labor halted the appeals to try to keep that and came up with a lower compromise amount. And so people would likely expect something similar if former President Trump were reelected in November. But if Vice President Harris were elected, that her Department of Labor, Department of Justice may keep pushing this in court. I hope this is helpful. If you have additional questions, there's tons of information on law firm websites, but I try to provide this to break it down.